crossed the we just crossed the 8 billion mark, and this is very much on schedule. The population of the world is also overwhelmingly going to be urban, as we also expect. None of this is controversial. Here you see the data. We presented this back in Berlin 2 years ago. Now, expectation of growth in the next few years is the darker yellow area versus the kind of current area, which is lighter yellow, and this is divided by income level, right? Low, medium, and high. And you can see how many more billions of people are going to be joining us in cities by income, and where the big numbers are, medium and low, obviously bigger than high. But that's where we are, and this is where we're going. Now, in the meantime, let me give you some numbers on the number of rides that have been taken on shared vehicles in the United States. Now, this is the problem is having both historic data and global data and different modal data in the same place. We don't have yet, but we have some indicative numbers. This is what the story looks like for the US. This is NACDA. This is data from an association that gathers this data. And you can see the red represents actually scooters, and sort of in the middle is dockless e-bikes or bikes. And I don't have it for 19 and 20 in that way, but I have sort of the overall picture. That's why those are all solid bars. So what happened? Now, if you were to, animate this, you'd be like, oh, nice growth to 2017, and then boom, something happened in 2018. And what happened were scooters. And that ratio, about 50% scooters, 50% bikes, carried forward in 2019. So you can imagine that half that bar, which is about 80, half being 80, total being about 160, would have been scooters. So that would have been a big boom. Obviously, and we are guilty of this as much, to see that pattern into 2019 and extrapolate it forward. But then COVID hit, and we had 2020, which was actually lower than 19. Oh, sorry, lower than 18. But then 21 came, and it actually recovered. And we're in the midst of 2022, and it's still recovering. And we're actually at the second highest level in 21 that we've ever seen in ride volumes. Clearly, though, a lot of people got swept under in 2020, and there's still probably some overhang from the overinvestment that happened in 2019. And we're hearing a lot of negative news about it, and the pendulum is swinging, but that is not indicative of what people are actually doing. Here's a summary also from the NABSA, which is the not just the number you've been looking at is the middle one, trips per year. So we have 157, 83, and then 128, but also in terms of systems in North America, this also includes Canada and Mexico, 292, 224, and 298. So we're at the highest level in terms of systems. In terms of vehicles, even higher. We're at 232. This is in thousands in North America again. So this tells you a picture. It's it's indicative. But guess what? The United States is the worst market. It's been the worst market. It's taken the largest hit globally in terms of reduction in the number of service companies and in terms of vehicles. This actually expands a little bit more on the split in, as I already showed, but this kind of also shows the split in vehicles. And roughly, again, 50-50 between both trips and vehicles. And you can actually calculate from this utilization, assuming that these vehicles were out the whole year. Probably not the case, but and there's subtle differences between e-bikes and regular bikes, and so there's some of that is all in here. You can get this report for free. Nothing proprietary here. Feel free to dig in if you want. In terms of the North American operators landscape, 298, let's say 300 cities in 2021. The color scheme here shows whether they're both bikes and scooters or bikes only and scooters only. Again, it's not a particularly, it's large population centers. That's the insight you might get from this. It also seems like Canada is underrepresented for some reason, but maybe, the data isn't as good there. Now, the global picture. Now, you saw the United States, you saw the numbers there. Now, imagine what's going on worldwide. First, look at the United States. This particular map shows by red dots, shows actually bikes only, the number of systems that have been deleted or have exited. The green dots are the ones that are active. And notice the concentrations both in Europe and in China and even in Japan. You know, obviously, we have some Central America, we have some Pacific, New Zealand, Australia, we even have some in Africa. But the concentration in Europe, by the way, is bigger as population goes, but not as big as these dots would represent. So the clearly there's opportunity. There's some red dots in Europe as well, red dots in China as well. But that's been the story for bike sharing again. And you can assume scooter sharing is somewhat another replication of this story to a different extent. Here's the overall system growth. By the way, this map is available bikesharingworldmap.com. You can see bike sharing. There was this wobble, 1819, sort of a recovery in terms of number of systems, flattened out a little bit. But if you look at Europe alone, which is one sample I pulled, just to illustrate, which is the second picture here on the right, bike sharing in Europe actually continues to grow, has never slowed. Overall net number of operators. And you can see the added operators is blue bars and gray are the subtractions. So yes, there's been a surge of subtraction in 18, 19, and 20. And by the way, this data was halfway through 2021, so it's not even illustrating all of the year. But nonetheless, that's been the pattern. Global, Europe, still a lot of growth happening. Asia, still a lot of growth happening. Now, if you were to look at the countries, not just the regions, number one, number of systems in China. I mean, look at the difference. China 673, second biggest. United States 174. This is again only bikes, and then on down, Germany, Italy, and France. Plenty of opportunities outside of those major markets. However, as the data shows. So again, what the media might be reporting on is 1 or 2 failures. Yes, they're substantial, but if you have 5, 6, 10 failures, you're talking about overall the number of systems being, if I could go back here, there's actually a total you can read here, about, actually it kind of got cut off, it looks like, but it's somewhere above 1,200. Now there's an estimate, and this is not a particularly trustworthy one, but this is what estimates are all about. This is in terms of revenue for e-scooter sharing. Perhaps a little bit optimistic, and going out to 2026, there's still kind of a hope that could reach 2.8 billion. But again, you do your own estimates. I'm only pointing out the fact that several people have been looking at this, and there's still some positive thoughts going on. Now, as far as practicalities, how big is the market is that, every city is an opportunity, even within a city, a regional or a subset of a city. All of these are different ways of segmenting. And we've always been saying that these are your customers. Cities are your customers. If you're in sharing, you have to think of it that way. They're territories, but they're also constituencies, and you have to decide how to address them. There are ways to segment this market, and you can segment it by, population, modal share. You can look at, demand in those axes, but you could also look at, what is the political landscape? What is the, what's the track record? What's the infrastructure spending on alternatives to automobility? So you can smell the kind of the way the things are going, and then segment accordingly. But keep in mind, there's a huge amount of data for modeling cities and opportunities. I would say it's a multi-step process. First, you filter through the data, and then you filter through yet again with another sort of subjective analysis. But fundamentally, by 2035, we're looking at least 3,377 markets, which are substantially large cities. Now, if you're looking at small and medium cities, you're looking at 25,000 at least. Actually, I shouldn't say small, I'd say mid-sized cities, you're looking at 25,000 markets. But this 3,000, the largest cities in the world, which are over 300,000 in population, are a 3.3 billion person opportunity. So fundamentally, it's all about segmentation. We've been saying this all along. Figure out where in this large, who's the early adopter, who's the laggard, who's the middle, who's the late. And all of these things are going to determine where you put your energy. Don't waste time on cities that are not going to be great. Let me give you this other perspective. It's just one of the public data sets out there. Look at the number of cities that are growing. So there's the urban growth, and then do an XY plot with the actual ownership of vehicles that exist today. And today that means automobiles mostly. And although this data is 2015, what you see is the highest growing markets. That's what's happening over up on the upper side of the graph, right? Which happens to be also on the left side here. The highest growing populations have the least number of cars. The highest number of car owners, that is above the 80% mark. That's the USA. And you see those are American cities over there. And you see their growth rates. Now, the US happens to be a little bit faster than Japan. Japan actually has negative growth rates. And Western Europe has sort of somewhere in the middle there. In terms of car ownership, is around 50%. US is at 80%, Japan is at 60%. But everybody else, which is growing much faster, has almost no automobility today. And we've pointed out what the cost would be, the fact that automobility is not affordable for the next 3 billion. There's not space, there's not infrastructure, and certainly not going to be that much fuel. So that's where we think the opportunity still lies. That doesn't exclude the US, does not exclude Western Europe, but we're just saying that there's a lot of empty space out there. There's a lot of market creation opportunity that we think in the next 15 years is going to get addressed. And that will happen through a process of active salesmanship. And this is what I want. I invite James to help us think through this. And James, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Horace. That was awesome. I also just love that soundbite on the fastest growing cities have the least amount of cars, and adoption doesn't necessarily. It's not inevitable that adoption makes sense for cars in those markets. That's fascinating. And then the other quote there, again, just thinking about it a little bit from the sales landscape of I think it was 3,300 markets comprised about 3.3 billion people. That's quite a TAM to attack. So yeah, thank you for that, Horace. With of course Horace, as always, laying out such I think a strong argument from a pro's perspective with the data. I wanted to follow it up with a little bit of just some tactical thoughts and execution as it relates to, of course, what we've seen since we started the company 4 years ago, and some of the trends I've seen in talking to basically every shared provider of any sort of size that's been to our events. I've had a chance to talk to a lot of them, and some of the trends I've seen, and maybe just a way to think about attacking the market. So I'm going to pull up a presentation as well, entitled selling shared. And again, I think with the backdrop of everything Horace said, I won't go too much into the why would you want to sell in this market. I think even though the news is so negative, it's apparent that there is some inevitability to the idea that shared will be a very big business in time. So I want to start by, of course, also laying out, not only is there terrible news in the market about shared providers. This week, the topic du jour, of course, is some of the accounting issues with Bird. But it's also important to note that the entire growth technology marketplace is in a very rough place. So I'm showing that actually with just a very simple chart. But what this chart is showing you actually is the next 12 months NTM revenue multiples for enterprise software companies that are public in the United States. And what you could see is this sort of inverse relationship between where the 10-year treasury is. That would be the rate that, of course, is a bond that's set against the federal fund rates, versus the valuations, of course, of enterprise software companies. And what you can see is those valuations are coming down very quickly in the darker line. And that's because, of course, the 10-year rate is going up. And this is a slightly older chart, but basically the 10-year rate is now above 4%. And so we're in this chart, it only goes back to 2015, because really there isn't a lot of enterprise software companies outside of Salesforce and NetSuite and a few others that were actually around long enough to really chart the path of what multiples might look like as interest rates rise. But I think we can all agree that going into next year, we're going into an environment of most likely higher interest rates to combat inflation, which is going to mean most likely the valuations for high growth and emerging growth companies is really going to change. And really, for the first time in many people that have only been in the workforce for say 10 to 15 years, we're going to a very different shift in terms of what the market might value as it relates to growth versus sort of free cash flow. And so I think overall we have a lot of negativity no matter what. But with micromobility, of course, we're not the only ones, I would say. But we can also maybe be stewards, which is, for us, this is not the first time, right? So where some of our friends in software and other growth type companies are most likely going into next year really struggling, doing layoffs. In the world of micro, we've kind of been through this, as even a little bit of Horace's chart showed, right? We saw a blip going back from what happened in 2019, also, of course, what happened with COVID and how much that impacted our business. So hopefully what that also means is we can react quicker and get out of this bust cycle quicker and start to boom again. So again, the topic that Luke picked for the day, I just wanted to sort of set the definition of contrarian, so we can all be on the same page. But generally, a contrarian is someone, a person who opposes or rejects popular opinion. So I try to take a contrarian lens onto how I've seen shared go to market to date, and how you might want to think again slightly differently about that. Because again, with this inevitability that someone maybe not just one, but many will win in shared, might not happen today or tomorrow. But I would also argue maybe we need a very different take on how we've been going to market and selling shared. Horace mentioned this briefly, but I think the question we want to ask in the shared marketplace is, who is the customer, right? Who is our customer? This is sort of fundamentally, and again, a first principles manner, the first thing you need to answer when building of course, your company and your service and your product. Who am I actually selling to? And while this might seem obvious, of course, it's not completely obvious in the world of shared micromobility. There's sort of three core business models you might think about in the world of micromobility that we service. We service over 1,500 companies in our micromobility landscape, and they generally bucket in these three areas, right? B2C, that means you're selling your micromobility vehicles, accessory or services to the consumer. B2B, selling those to businesses, or B2G. And of course, in the shared model, you kind of have this challenge where in many ways, of course, you're selling to business to government, right? But then you're, of course, making your money actually from that customer, from that consumer. But what I would say is, and again, if I were to critique some of the original shared providers, I think there was way too much emphasis on actually getting to the consumer and not focusing on your first order customer. I think part of that, the blame there, though, of course, is on the government in terms of how your first customer actually made you market and actually made you, focus on the consumer. But again, this job is too hard. It's too hard to sell to two different types of customers. I think there really needs to be focus. And so, for this presentation, I'll talk very specifically about selling to the government. And so the first thing I do want to mention again is how hard your job is in selling to the government, right? So I've got two examples here. These are both actually from the last month, and showing just how hard it is to work with your customer. I think we can all agree, coming up in shared micromobility, a lot of the progressive political leaders have been interested in what we're doing, whether it's from an equality perspective, an equity perspective, of course, a climate perspective. But what I'm trying to highlight here is, you haven't had a lot of friends among your customer base. And the example on the left is showing this is a quote from David Zipper, a tweet he put out, where basically he was hearing from politicians, sort of secondhand, how their goal was to drive you to the brink of bankruptcy, meaning they were going to regulate you and enforce things hard enough on you, just to the point where you weren't going to have, or just eke it out, just survive. A lot of this, of course, is blowback from the days of ride sharing. Of course, shared micromobility came after ride sharing, and this idea that we won't have I've heard at our conferences in the past, we won't have another Uber on our watch. And you hear that and you think like, that's that's very strange thinking, right? Like, that's very zero sum thinking. That's not the way we want to think about. That's not the way markets tend to work, and how even, of course, capitalism works, which is the system that most of us are under. And so that's a challenge. On the right, you have a different challenge. Like, and again, this is a quote, tweet from last week, showing how there's actually some threat in one of the best shared micromobility markets in the world, Paris, that they're going to shut it down. And that's because you've got new elected leaders on the right who, for lack of a better term, I'd say, are just sort of anti-technology, anti-progress. And of course, there's people in Paris that don't like the things like shared scooters. So my point here, just to level set start, is if your customer is, of course, the government, one thing that you have to be very careful on is to not be partisan at all. And while your customer can be elected with a 51% majority, in the case of running a business, if 49% of the people hate you, you're in big trouble. You would never see an NPS score like that if you're trying to run a business, right? You need a much higher NPS score. You need everyone to love you. So the first thing I would try to level set on is being partisan, as much as, of course, you need to sell into different political leaders. It's a very dangerous process for you in your business. And again, I empathize with this. This is not easy. And so with that, the question I would ask you, and the question I've been asking a lot of people lately, and from a contrarian lens, is, where's your sales team? If you're in shared micro, who are the people responsible for selling to your customer? So I just did a little fun exercise. I took a bunch of, and not picking on anyone, this was universal. I just took a bunch of screenshots from the jobs boards across multiple shared companies. And what you could see is, of course, they're hiring a little less than normal, but they're still hiring. But you don't see any sales roles. And even if you dig into the business development or growth roles, they're not sales roles. They're not quota carrying. They're not. They aren't written in the way you might want to recruit and hire salespeople. And I guess one other thing I should say is, prior to starting Micromobility, I had started a enterprise software company. I sold to Fortune 5,000 companies. My company before it was acquired was about 300 people. We've got a 100-person sales team. So I've hired, fired, managed a lot, pretty large enterprise sales teams over time. So I know when a job spec is written for an enterprise seller, and I don't see it anywhere across this landscape at all. And of course, that's the way we're going to market right now. I think there is the non-contrarian take and go-to-market model today is you work with government leaders via government relations teams. These are people that are often very well-versed in city policy and GR. But again, they aren't sellers in the traditional sense. And my question to you is, it's very hard to sell into the enterprise if you don't have sellers that can understand pain, can understand business objectives, can understand ROI modeling, and can use all that information, bring it all in, and build a sales methodology in order to sell into them. So I think this is a huge gap in the market, this idea that we go to market and we sell to what are effectively the largest companies in the world, which are the governments, and we do this without any sellers to help make that happen. So what I wanted to do is just start with a very simple framework. And this is a very simple sales methodology. It's probably sales methodology 101. We can get much more advanced with this if we want to. But this would just be a very simple way to think about, are we approaching our customer correctly? Again, the government. And are we actually thinking about selling into them? And I'll also preface this by saying, I realize that the government doesn't give you any money. The money ultimately comes from the customers. But again, I would also just reframe our thinking there potentially on what is money, what is access, what is marketing, what is all the things that the government can offer to you. And you could use actually a sales methodology to go in there and make sure that you get it in order to have a successful pilot and ongoing execution. Sorry, I just have a question. Okay, yeah, so it's fine to ask a question. We'll get to questions in just a second when I finish here. So let's start with BANT. And so BANT stands for budget, authority, need, and timeline. And so I'll just go through these very quickly. Budget, the first thing you want to understand in selling in is, who owns the budget and how much are they willing to spend? This is not my definition. This is a general definition of a framework like BANT. So let's just keep that in mind. Let's think about budget. Who has ultimately the power to make something happen inside the organization and many people? And how are we getting as much of that as we can where our need matches the pain or the objectives that the customer has? The second is authority, right? So ultimately, you generally have authority lines and approval lines, but who ultimately has the most authority inside the organization? And are we talking to those people? So that as we go through a sales process, we know that we're at the highest point and we have maximal authority to get something done that we want to get done. Need, right? So again, this goes back to the very nature of how we sell and how we market, right? But what is the need you're solving for? And of course, always understand in any sales situation, the bigger the gap between the perceived, reality of where they want to be versus the perceived reality of where they are, the bigger that variance or delta is, the bigger opportunity you have to sell, right? The more leverage you have, and the more ability is that you can actually get as much as possible through that out of that relationship. And then time, right? So the last part of BANT is part time. So, what is an overall timeline where you can get the deal done? This is, of course, very important for forecasting, for you to hit quarterly numbers, monthly numbers, whatever it might be. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to take BANT and now let's apply it to with a government lens on it from a shared scooter perspective, or shared operator perspective, I should say, and how we might want to think about it. So again, because you're not actually getting like say a direct, this much money from them, I just like to think about it slightly differently. So the questions I'd be looking to ask the government, for instance, my customer, is like, how much are you investing to make sure that we take a turn profit? And again, I've seen a lot of RFPs. I've seen a lot of the ways that we approach the government in conversations, even of course at our events. But how much of this onus do we actually put on the government? Like you cannot go into a relationship without a profit, right? And so how is the government, your customer, ensuring that they're going to make that happen for you, right? Let's ask those questions. Let's push back on that framework, because I think turning it on its head like that could be very helpful. Another question might be, what is the co-marketing we can do that is cheap for the government, but could make a huge difference in rider volume, right? We know, I was talking from Alex from Drover yesterday, right? Like, none of the scooters, for instance, in the US can do any advertising on the vehicles, right? That potentially could be very cheap for the government to roll out, but it's very, of course, expensive, or that kind of marketing value could be huge for the shared provider. And of course, we've seen success with that with the sharing bikes here in the United States as an example. And then, what are the other incentives that the government can offer to ensure people will mode shift and see micromobility as a viable solution, right? So again, this is just a subtle example of how to think about budget differently and how to potentially turn the conversation from a conversation where you're selling in, of course, but you're hearing from the government how they're going to help you. To go into authority, so of course it's like, it's the person I'm talking to, can they buy them? But then the other things that we have to think about with the government is like, is the person I'm actually talking to, what kind of role are they in? How are they elected? Are they appointed? Are they elected by the people? What term length are they on? Are they going to be there when we actually, these ROI metrics we agree on, will they still be in office? Will I be dealing with someone else? So authority becomes a very sticky subject, especially in a world, and I'll get to it a little bit with timing, in a world where I see so much of the shared operators to date have been about, hey, let's just get in, and once we're willing, we'll stick. Has not happened to date at all, right? And I know that's a great sales model potentially for a lot of ways that you'd sell to the government in more of a software situation, or a situation where you're building a parking lot or something. But in the case of shared micro, what we've seen a ton of is churn after a year contract, because your authority changes, because politicians move at the whim of their people, and maybe the scooters or bikes are creating clutter. This can't happen to you if you're going to be able to forecast your business long term. So understanding authority and understanding how you have multiple lines of authority and how long those people are going to be in their positions, and ensuring you budget and ensuring you access is very important. Need. So again, just going into like, how long is the budget owner going to be in the position? What happens if their position changes? How is success measured? What assurances do you have that these success metrics won't change? What happens if they don't achieve these goals? All these things are critical. And this is where, again, if I were to take just a brief moment, like one concern I have for a lot of the shared operators is I know they go in under the guise of, well, not guys, but they go in under the lens of climate change, for instance, carbon capture, the ability to, just reduce carbon emissions. And what I'd say there is you need to be very careful. One, we know climate is a very partisan topic where you could be out at the whims of, partisan politics. Two, a lot of the climate models that come in, say, with third-party consultants, those change quickly too. when you're building need models, when you're building ROI models with the government, make sure your models are concrete and can't change, because that's not fair to you. You know, you can't, if you have an ROI model, you go in and then they say, yeah, you know, we're kind of wrong about climate, or we brought in a different consulting firm and they're thinking about climate differently or carbon differently. You know, and they want to discount more because of the lithium ion batteries or whatever you're using. Like, you're going to get shot in the back of the head. That's not fair to you. And that's not what you agreed to originally. So I'd really think about need through the lens of what's our ROI models and how do those stay consistent no matter what might happen, what kind of political leader might come in, that allows you to of course survive. And then finally, on timing, again, I wouldn't think about it as the structure of like, when can we get this deal done, how you might traditionally think about a sales methodology. What I think we really need to be contrarian about is, how long are we signing contracts for? So the old adage of, you don't need a long contract when you originally start with the government, because once you get in, they're too slow to rip you out. That is clearly not the case with shared micromobility. So I would love to ask the question, why are we not signing longer term contracts, right? Space contracts are 20 years. Cloud contracts with the government, like AWS and Azure contracts, are at least 10 years, multi-billion-dollar contracts. The amount of work I've seen shared companies do to get into the governments, to get the fleets on the streets, to deal with the damage, to hire the vehicle services. Why on earth are we doing 1 to 2 year contracts? This is incredible CapEx you're putting out, incredible amount of marketing you're doing. These contracts should be 5 to 10 years long. And of course, the government doesn't want to do that. They don't want the risk. They don't want all this. But that's why we're in sales. That's what we need to do. We need to change the conversation, because you can't survive if your hottest market, Paris, says, oh, we're out because of a change of agenda. That just makes your job impossible. And again, this is done through sellers that understand this, understand how to package needs, understand how to show ROI over long timeframes, and then, of course, secure the longer term contracts. So to conclude, and again, I appreciate you on my contrarian rant here. I think my overall conclusion is, one, ask for more. That's always the job of the seller, right? And it's understanding how to ask for more, which there's usually reasons. Creating multiple relationships so that you don't have key person risk. And again, I would advise you to create ROI metrics that won't change, and also avoiding partisanship where possible. I'm out here in LA right now at Commotion yesterday. I looked at the entire agenda. Again, just an interesting insight. Here in America, there was not a single person that was an elected official that was speaking yesterday that was a Republican. That is at least 50% of the American base, if 40%, right? That's not a way we're going to scale, right? Like, we need both sides of the aisle to understand and see value in this, and I think they will, right? We have a solution for people, not for Democrats. So, like, how are we avoiding partisanship and also selling into both sides? And then finally, of course, mandating longer contract terms so you can invest in your business, you can have some lock-in, you can start to model ROI metrics that other cities can see and see the long-term sustainability, and which, of course, I think makes you incredibly successful and allows you to take your business out and raise more capital and get investors excited. So, sorry, that's it for me on my end. I will stop the share, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah, actually, Horace, I know you responded here, but maybe I'll read the question and you could respond for the group.
Sure, we can both respond. I just wanted to make use of the time.
Yeah, okay, great. So first question here is, the scooter market in Europe isn't as binary as what David Zipper claims or what is happening in Paris. This is clickbait. In fact, the majority of European cities are experiencing a level of institutional maturity, and this is attributed to, 1, infrastructure improvements, 2, public tenders. And this, of course, is aligned with the contrarian theme of today's webinar. Yeah, Horace, do you want to respond to that? I know you.
Yeah, so absolutely. And again, the point of Zipper's comment, I think our inclusion of it was to be provocative, to point out the fact that there are people who are saying these things. And that we are cherry picking somewhat, red flags here. But the interesting dichotomy here is between, let's say, what we consider to be left and right in the U.S., which is right tends to be more regressive and left seems to be more progressive. But if you were to do the same thing and ask what's the situation in Europe, well, in some ways there's a left or right there, but overall it seems like all of Europe is further towards more progressive than all of the U.S. So that was noted in my data as well. the thing that I was struck by is, historically speaking, during World War II is, something similar happened where there was a dichotomy between U.S. and Europe, and the U.S. actually was more willing to provide profit motives. This came out in a book called Freedom's Forge, and we think about the U.S. just having a lot of capacity to produce, but the incentives had a large part to play, where the U.S. had a cost plus structure, where in Europe it was like, well, no profit can be allowed. Obviously, we're at war. We can't allow somebody to make money during a time of war. But the U.S. said, if you allow an incentive system to take place, people will innovate. And what the U.S. did to innovate was like they created subcontracting, which meant like, you doubled or tripled the amount of applied, power in the system, if you will. That led to excess production and excess efficiency, like 5-to-1 at least, depending what you measure. Now, the point of it is this: the Europeans are smarter at this point in time. We've got to educate the Americans, and vice versa if we see if we see an opportunity. But the idea is to say, guys, look, there's a proof over there that this works better, and we end up with better climate. We end up with better cities. We end up with more re-elected officials, which is what the currency of politics is, right? Ask what is the situation of the mayor of Paris? What is the situation of the mayor of Barcelona that had the most progressive policies? They kept getting reelected and got more and more done. So that's really what matters. So I think part of the sales process that James is talking about is like, you got to understand the job of the person you're talking to. What is their key performance criteria, right? What is it that they need to accomplish? It could be that they need to stay in office, and maybe that they want to retire, maybe that they want to stay long enough to retire. You got to figure out a way to sell them on that, that this helps them achieve those goals, right? It seems cynical, but that's really, you're dealing with people at the end of the day. It's not that you're selling into a system, you're selling into people. Pick the right people, navigate your way around, and that's 100% sales. All that we're saying here in the seminar is that there's a lot of best practices out there in sales. Make use of them. Just borrow heavily from the intelligence that's been developed over the years, and think of your job not as persuasion, not as lobbying, but sales. And then I think you kind of just go through the process, and it's just good common sense.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, James?
No, I think very well said. It's also just like I just want to re-mention Freedom Forge. I think that's a great potential just piece of history to pick up, to read, and again, potentially take a different attack mode and contrarian take on how you might want to interface with the government and the potential ways that you could convince them to rethink incentives, and and again, a really inspirational story, I think, on how markets were built.
It's a lot of it is sales. I mean, I don't know directly how to do enterprise sales, but I talked to a few guys over the years, and they said, it's all storytelling. You got to tell them a great story that they love to hear. So one of the things is like, are they interested in listening to environmental stories? Do they want to hear about the fact that disadvantaged people are made, more equitable? What's the story you want to tell? And then match the product and solution to that story. That's a lot of very simple-minded thinking. But you'll find that most people in government are not sophisticated quantitative analysis people, right? They might have some advisory on that, but the main question is, hey, what can you do for us today? So yeah, it's good advice. And thanks for pointing out the fact that Europe is a little bit more enlightened on these matters. And if that's the case, then bring that story to America. And if you're selling in America, tell them how Europeans do it. And for Europeans, tell them how Americans built great stories like the iPhone and Android and how that helped the world, right? So bring innovation to Europe as well.
Just one more point on the European point. I would like to point out, like, and again, whether or not the article was sensationalist by Adrian, the idea that DOT and the other providers, Lime, that they even could be up for even that they could the regressive side of the political party could pull them out, again, is a threat you don't want to deal with as a company that's trying to forecast their business. This idea that you're doing a renewal every year, I think those contracts are either on every year or every other year, and it makes your business insanely hard to run when you're selling to infrastructure, selling in that much infrastructure. So the question I'd have for the Europeans, if anyone has an opinion, is are you seeing longer term contracts, and what are you doing to enable them? Again, an article like that is a great opportunity for the seller at the shared provider to go in and say, hey guys, whether or not this is true, the idea that you could just pull us out in 6 months makes our job, and you're just going to bankrupt us. Like this threat could potentially curtail our entire business if that's our largest market and where we have great ridership. And so we have to ensure in order to hit our ROI models, you can't do that. And you understand that, like, just like, the NASA can't pull the SpaceX contract tomorrow. It's through 2030. Like that business is assured. Trump might not like Bezos. He can't pull the AWS contract. It's a $10 billion contract in writing. And, and that was done through a very solid, strong strategic sales process. So whether or not the article is true, the threat should not even occur if you're trying to build a sustainable business, in my opinion. So I would just love to understand, if the European market is further ahead, why aren't the contracts further ahead? Why are we going on a whim of a year or two?
When I visited Washington a few years back, it was right at the beginning of COVID, and actually before it started off, it was that winter. I remember I went in front of both staffers at Senate and House, and then of course at the time it was still the Trump administration, so I got to the Department of Transportation as well. Now I was coached by the lobbyist who was taking me around. Very smart man. He said, "Look, figure out ahead of time what story you want to tell to each side of the aisle." So, like the story for anyone who's serving on the Democratic staff was, hey, we're about cities. We want to, enable people who are disadvantaged. We want to create opportunity. And if you talk to the Trump administration, it was like, hey, let me remind you that even though Europe was ahead in mobile phones early on, and Japan was ahead of mobile phones, it was American industry that created the iPhone. It was American industry that created Google and Android, and now those are two dominant platforms. And so the U.S. is, at the time, it was a laggard, right, in terms of micromobility. And I said, we want to make sure that American companies are the leading in this area. So please don't put more obstacles in front of us. So that was the conversation to be had. It's a very sort of tactical political thing. Overall, I'm not bipartisan. I'm nonpartisan. So I'm like saying, I think we want to do micromobility because it's good for everybody. So you have to have this point of view. And if you communicate heavily on your public side that you're kind of, let's say, maybe partisan in some way, just be mindful of that. It's better to have a neutral voice.
Yeah.
We did have a follow-up, by the way. I think it's the same person. Yes, it is. So, and most cities are not looking to squeeze to bankrupt scooter company, at least not amongst the majority of European municipalities. Just smarter regulations that protect pedestrians, reduce injury, and manage the public right away. All great pitches, right? You gotta say these things intelligently and with data to defend yourself. Good old Aristotle, ethos, pathos, logos. The art of rhetoric. And my answer was that the entirety of sales strategy for shared micros, basically to identify precisely who are the attractive customers and who are unattractive customers, stack rank them, approach them, and invest accordingly. But note that political winds can change. This is one of the problems, and this is why protecting yourself is about saying, okay, we got to have a long enough time frame. We've got to make sure that we're not going to get kicked out for arbitrary reasons. And that's a tougher thing to sell. It's like, if you do get in the door, make sure the terms are appropriate for your business. It just doesn't make sense to invest and then be forced to lose that equity you built. It's almost like, to me, it feels like a property rights issue. What is the property you've obtained by getting in there? It's essentially a contract, but if that contract's very weak, then you haven't got a lot of property haven't got a lot of equity in the system. So it's just a matter of being prudent. We're not giving you here kind of magical formulas. We're just saying, be prudent, be mindful, be particularly careful, and but persistence is also key.
Yeah, and yeah, I think those are all good points. I'd just like to point out one more thing, and Horace, I think that lobbyist gave you really interesting information on how to talk to the left versus the right. Again, one other thing, and I haven't seen any shared company do this, but one thing that's definitely happening in growth technology companies, really being led by the venture capital firm A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz and Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, is this concept of American dynamism. And they're calling it that, sort of like, what are the companies that reflect American dynamism? These are companies that really invest heavily in America. A lot of it's about reshoring. A lot of it's about building great businesses that will employ a lot of Americans, as an example. This is primarily, a call actually to more of the, what traditionally would be the right side of the political spectrum. And I'm very intrigued by the idea of, again, micro companies trying to adopt some of this pitch and go after areas of the country. Like it's pretty clear. If you look at betting markets today, it looks like, DeSantis is most likely the next president of the United States as of today. That will change, of course, but he's a Florida Republican, right? So if you're a company and you've got to start to think about selling 3 or 4 years out, some of this American dynamism language could be a very good way to think about, going after a market that you currently aren't in, or there isn't a lot of, shared opportunities in. So there's all sorts of things there that I think is really smart. And again, maybe this sounds like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, but it's not. As a seller, your job is to understand the needs of your customer, and you're trying to give back to them what you've heard from them. And so those are all sorts of opportunities that you have, I think, by if you are listening, and willing to willing to do what the customer needs. And again, when you have long-term contracts, once you're in the door, ideally you're in much better shape, even if those winds change.
Absolutely. So it's but by the way, I want to give you guys kind of an opportunity to call on us if you have questions, like, maybe you're stuck in a situation, you're looking for data. As I try to show, most of what I have is public, but maybe we just know where it is. And so happy to share with you, kind of the sales arguments to be made, especially since you might be focused very narrowly in your region, and we're looking globally. So we're present globally, and as a result, we absorb a lot of facts. So happy to help you guys on any of these types of, what argument would work in this situation, type of situation. And by the way, some of the most exciting things, just before the seminar, I got an inbound on Twitter via somebody said, I hope you guys get to talk about San Juan, Puerto Rico, because it's doing really well there. Now, San Juan is part of the United States. And I've been there many years ago, admittedly, before micromobility. And it's an old town. It's very much, although there's a sprawling outer area as well. The city is very, very has very bad traffic, and it's not a place you might think of, but it's a very highly populated and American city in many ways, like the dollar and American cultures there. So you sometimes find these opportunities. And by the way, this person said that the micro is doing really well in San Juan, and it's an outlier. But there's also places like Bogota, Colombia, for example, because there it's a very hilly city. So if you have anything electric, it really, really helps when the only alternative is a car. So there's opportunities in some places that are not what you might consider the Paris and Rome and the capital cities. Like I said, 3,300 communities, all of them very large. And we keep going on about the emerging markets, which is kind of a third option here between Europe and or even fourth option, Asia, Europe, and US. There's a lot going on there. Some of those folks do come to our conferences, and we really encourage them. You'll find weird modal choices. You'll find a lot more motorcycles there. You'll find more three-wheelers in India, for example. But sometimes there's great opportunities to cross-pollinate. If you see something brilliant elsewhere, you might want to bring it over. In case you forgot, bike sharing, as it came to the United States and even to Europe, came via China, because China had a huge boom early on in free floating, not just bikes, but mostly this idea of booking one anywhere with a smart lock. That was an idea that was copied by Lime initially in the United States, bringing something over. And before they were called Lime bikes before they became Lime. So again, think outside your own territory for ideas. I think as far as cities are concerned, again, many of them will respond with, well, we're not Amsterdam or we're not Copenhagen. Things are done different over here in, I don't know, Charlotte, North Carolina. Well, admittedly so, but you got to say what's in common, right? So keep persisting with the right message, localize the message, make it actionable. But I've been privileged to have a lot of opportunity to travel, and I tell you, people are much more alike than they are different. So places all have the same needs. So there's a lot to learn from each other. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a couple here. First question from Roman. Are micro companies playing well with data collector, analyst, advisor card towards cities? How to balance sharing this data while protecting a competitive advantage? You have a good answer there at all, Horace?
Where do you see this question? Because I don't see
an open question in the Q&A.
Oh, open, I see it. Sorry, I was unanswered. Yes. So playing well in the data collector analyst. Yeah, so the thing is that data is one of the things that actually is a great pitch to say that, look, we can collect information for ourselves, but we can collect it for you as well. So this was early on a great story to tell for Micro. And the problem was that we would only be able to track like where people started and when they ended their journeys, because we only had that time stamp and location stamp, and that was all we had. But in the meantime, with imaging, we've been able to see more. We've been able to collect even other sensor data if you want to mount it on the bike. So that might be a negotiating tactic. You might come in and say, hey, with a little bit of investment, we can actually, for example, measure air quality. And you can say, we can do that on a timestamp basis, and we can get that information. We can even, with an accelerometer, measure the quality of the road surfaces. I've heard all of these ideas, and their eyes will open up. I'm privileged to also know a company called Nexar that does dash cams for cars, and they sell their data by saying we can spot signage that's out of place on a street, because using AI and other techniques, they can actually image a lot more. And cities are unaware unless they send an inspector as to what's going on the street. So there's a lot of things you can do to parlay the fact that you're traversing the city millions of times a year. So there's
a good one on that note in the micro framework is, companies like Drover can now look at, for instance, if a car is parked in a bike lane and do immediate enforcement on that, like we're now in New York City, they're crowdsourcing the ability to alert any vehicle that's in a bike lane for an immediate penalty, immediate fine. Companies like that have these, of course, cameras and other AI on the vehicles can immediately, they could immediately get that information to the government for a ticketing process. And so there's all sorts of those types of opportunities there. It's literally a direct revenue engine, right? When you've got a shared fleet that's now armed with a ticketing machine, basically. For traffic enforcement.
Actually, so this gets more to the product development side, but I think it's like you can dangle that and say, if you give us sustenance, if you give us something that allows us to stay alive, we can come to you with more and more of these things. So we can make commitments. That it will not happen if you're trying to starve us. So it's another reason to say we'll get into a long term. Sean, let me just take his question now. Sean Connolly says, Horace and James, thanks for hosting this conversation. Do you have thoughts on where ridership, quote, safety across communities fits into the need sold to government? Vulnerable road user deaths are at an all-time high in the US. It has become more safe inside of vehicles and more fatal outside of the vehicle in the last 10 years. As often it's disadvantaged communities that are affected even more. So touched on equity a bit, but the idea that, I think particularly in the United States, pointing out the fact that these are vulnerable road users that however, tend to probably not have the opportunity to drive as much. You know, it depends where you are with and who you're talking to, because some people might say that, well, protecting them will cost a lot of money. We need to separate bike lanes and so on. But also to the idea that you create a healthier community by encouraging this type of behavior. The funny thing, and this is another anecdote. If I have a conversation with people who are in the city community, let's say in the city planning, city policy, city government world, they're often asking equity questions. They're often asking, how do you make sure as a capitalist coming into our community that you're going to provide an opportunity for those who are less advantaged? Everything that they were worried about was measurable on that basis. Now, again, this is more of a US story. And many of those people go to Europe and say, what are you doing there? And in Europe, they don't really, they're, as they say, colorblind. They just kind of provide it for everybody. They don't try to target those less advantaged first or more than those who are advantaged. It's simply a neutral point. So this is very political, and obviously it's just saddled with a lot of a connotation. So you've got to be careful with that. Mostly it's, the way I respond to it is this. This is a very simple thing I said. And then people were picking and saying, oh, this is more white male type privilege. Well, I said, I only quoted Susan B. Anthony that said that the bicycle is the instrument that has freed the lives of women more than anything else in the world. You have to look beyond the fact that there are some early adopters who are male. There are some early adopters who are privileged, but you have to understand that if you open it up and it really is universally available, it'll bring up people as much as it'll help those who are already up. So it's you've got to make the right emotional connection with the buyers here to understand what their job is. Don't be dismissive of it. Don't throw away the question as saying, oh, this is not relevant to us. Saying we are about helping people, whether, and if you want us to help some more than others, let's work out a way to do that. You got to be proactive about it. Don't forget they're not that way because they have a political inclination. It is the system. It's endemic. It's what the system is. Sorry. Yeah. Great question.
Sean, I just want to point out, as actually someone that's been hit by a car while operating a shared lift bike in my case, which was a pretty traumatic experience. I do want to point out that our data shows that you are correct that it has become more dangerous outside of the vehicle, but it also has become more dangerous inside of the vehicle. Car deaths are up as well. We are wrapping ourselves with bigger cars, but we're still dying at an ever increasing pace, inside and outside the vehicle. So it's not actually safer inside the vehicle. I just wanted to point that out. It's actually more dangerous inside the vehicle than it was before too. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's politics around helmets. There's politics around, bright clothing and all that. But again, don't brush it aside. But we got to deal with it and argue that we are responsible and are trying to help people. That's the fundamental thing. And I do beg sometimes people to realize that we are, after all, talking about the David, not the Goliath. Do not try to beat up on the David when obviously the Goliath is all the strength and all the opportunity right now. We're all trying to get a fair chance to operate, and it's not a fair fight to begin with, right? We are small and they are big, and so, but that's a source of strength as well, as the story actually tells you. It's an asymmetric fight. Having a projectile is a lot more powerful sometimes than having a sword. You got that range, right? So keep that in mind. But it's this whole workshop is about, find the inner salesman, saleswoman, find that person inside you that is all about empathy. It's all understanding, and then tailoring to the need. So. That was our mission, and hope this helped.
Yeah, thank you, Horace. I think that's a great way to conclude. I know we're just a little over time. Thank you for everyone that attended. Again, from hearing it from Micromobility Industries, we look at the data. There will be winners in this market. We hope it's you, and we'd love to help you get there. So thanks very much for joining, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.